Could we just get quick introductions?
Oh, okay. Like, and I'll just be okay. I'm Pastamaniacs, Alfonso, he, him, verbal POI, thanks. Okay.
Uh, DPM.
Oh, wait,
It's
you're all
fine. We can start. Honestly, it's fine.
okay.
Great. We can do this
Mm.
sometime else. Yeah,
Okay,
Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
thank you. So, one sec, I get my timer. Okay. Okay, first on setup, what do we think humanity's priorities are in this debate? The first thing to say is I think we're going to use a fairly utilitarian metric. Why? Because utility is the only external and universal framework in this debate, i.e., the sole way in which all humans see the world is through pain and pleasure. We should try to justify that. This crucially means that we have to account for the infinite number of possible future peoples that may exist. I want to do a second piece of framing on this, however. I think governments have a special obligation to people in the future. Why? The fundamental reason why governments owe duty to people in the first place is because fundamentally people like citizens within the state are coerced under the state in like they can force them to do things, tax them, send them to jail, and they have not consented into this. Thus the government restores their rights by serving them, by providing them these services, giving them security or whatever. The contrast to this is that future peoples are the most coerced because they are going to be born into the state, but they don't even have access to means of redress like elections in order to like control over what happens to them, i.e., because governments coerce them so much, governments therefore owe them even more a special duty. They should be weighed as more important because greater scale and unique duty. What is this apocalypse that is likely to happen? We think a variety of things could happen to the world. Maybe a climate apocalypse, despite our attempts to stop it. Maybe other reasons like a nuclear war, an AI takeover, whatever. Our policy is NGOs, whatever, and together we're going to stop climate conservation, which looks like not doing things to try and reduce the impact of climate change. But crucially, it's not the same as protecting people. For instance, building at your seawalls, I think that's still within our side of the debate because that's not about trying to stop climate change. It's just about protecting people right now. What does our preparedness mean? We're going to prepare for the worst case scenario if the world ends for any of these like reasons that I've just given. Obviously, we're still going to get basic levels of mitigation. We're still going to have negotiations to try and prevent a climate apocalypse through war, right? But it just looks like public education, building a critical infrastructure like your bunkers or whatever, training of response teams in order to make sure that some people survive this apocalypse. If it involves building a spaceship, so be it. That's what we're going to do. I'm going to run two substantives in this speech. The first on why we think an apocalypse is really likely to happen despite attempts to stop it, and we're unable to save the world now. And the second on why the best way to address this is to prepare rather than to try and conserve the climate. First, why do we think an apocalypse is likely to happen? Because international relations are tense. Why? Because more people have access to harmful technology, which leads to an increase of paranoia and a risk, and like risk of something happening. For instance, everyone has got nukes now. There's in the future things of space launch weapons. The idea is that because the capacity of this technology to be understood and mitigated and prevented is increasingly decreasing among every government in the world, therefore every government is likely to launch preemptive strikes upon each other in order to preserve like their own benefit and like the element of surprise. But secondly, we think we get a snowball effect which applies universally across all these different types of apocalypses. For first, it's got the international domino effect in the event of conflict, like we've seen with the world wars, except that now everyone's using nukes, so with a single press of a button, everyone just dies. But secondly, we think scientifically, your climate, for instance, is going to continue to get worse. We're already at a tipping point, like there's a 1.5 like degree increase that we've already failed to meet. The climate is only going to get worse and worse, and as natural disasters continue to increase and appear, our capacity to is going to continue to destabilize our world economy and our ability to mitigate these disasters. Why do you think that current efforts to mitigate and plans to prevent like these apocalypses are very difficult? A few reasons. First, because we don't actually understand a clear road path to doing this. Look at the natural forces. We don't really understand how it's worked because apocalypses have never happened on planet Earth before, as testified to by the fact that we still exist. This is the only world we have. We think the scientists that claim to know how to prevent this kind of apocalypses don't actually because we don't really understand fundamentally like the inner workings of our core and why we're going to die. Or in many cases, these scientists claim that the destruction of our Earth is inevitable. Then a couple hundred thousand years or whatever, we're going to die in the first place. And we say that we don't start now, we're never going to. But secondly, because of human irrationality, for the many for the many possible apocalypses that may happen, you may say they should be prevented by things like people by people refusing to like bear arms against each other or whatever. But two reasons why rationality kicks in. First, but fundamentally, many of our systems are actually based on single points of failure, which means that the risk of like, aggression and people engaging in conflict is very high. For instance, you have Donald Trump leading the United States. All it takes is one person or like a series of people to just consent to like using nuclear war in under the guise of wanting to protect our country and our sovereignty or whatever, and suddenly everyone is dead. But secondly, that we think fundamentally humanity's governments are controlled by irrational individuals, which means that the likelihood for these governments to leap into action to actually prevent things from happening, right? Other than aggression, which thing we've seen from the rise of like a right wing movement and like populism in across Europe and like basically everywhere in the world, looks like you get many stymied governments like the places in Germany and America, which were unable to actually pass good legislation on things like the climate. But finally, because many of these things are beyond our control or even smarter than us, look at AI, where your neural networks have literally evolved to become way smarter than the scientists that actually created them in the first place. So what are we saying here? First, that the process has started. It's observable that the climate is already moving towards like everyone dying of like massive heat stroke, whatever. It's observable that the risk of nuclear war is increased insofar as more countries have nuclear weapons and the political tensions are very, very high, right? And with being charitable that maybe not all of these things will happen, but one of them might be able to, because there's so many possible ways in which the world could end. But secondly, that it's unlikely to stop because because firstly, when it comes to apocalypses, the level of experience that humanity has mitigating these things is very low because we've never encountered these levels of technology and this level of danger before. So it's likely it's going to continue, and the consequence of this is you get apocalypse. The impact of an apocalypse is very simple. The world is going to that end. It looks like immense harm and destruction where cities are razed and people die. Second substantive, why we think preparation is therefore the best solution rather than climate conservation. Why is climate conservation so useless? First, because it's slow. Or like the first thing up the top is it only addresses one like particular form, right? Because we think apocalypses can happen in many ways, but climate conservation is something that has a political like opportunity cost, right? If I want to do something, right, climate conservation is something that's viewed by many, especially on the right wing, as being like if climate change is a hoax, as Trump would say, right? Or it's just a waste of resources. There's an opportunity cost because you can't direct it to focus on other things. Second, because it's slow. That even in their best case, climate conservation is something that is like very minimal impact because it's such a huge change that doesn't work. But three and most third, I think, is conditional on universal participation, which means every country in the world needs to focus on like trying to reverse this thing, which is very unlikely. Why? Because if you look at current climate conferences, like they're all stalling, right? Like our most recent COP, I'm not sure where, like nothing has happened. No one's been able to agree. They couldn't even make a decree on like reducing carbon emissions. Because firstly, there's a sense of injustice among the developing world. They don't believe they should be forced to contribute to these efforts when they've already been wronged in the past and they're now trying to industrialize. But secondly, you think the developed world is already plagued by stuff like an inability to even convince its own voters to focus on things like the climate. But largely because it's reactive. Because the effects of climate change have already kicked in, we think the maximum amount of mitigation you're going to get already exists on our side. You're not actually going to be able to stop it from getting worse. All countries have their hands full now with dealing with like rising floodwaters or whatever. This isn't saying that it's 100% doomed to failure, but we think even in the best case, it's not going to work. So we discount the impacts on the other side. Why is preparation much better? Because firstly, it's exclusive and definitely good. In the event that you do not prepare, no one is going to survive the apocalypse. It's likely to require high levels of preparation and like mobilization of technology or resources, which if you don't have specific preparation for this, everyone's just going to die and no human on earth will survive your apocalypse. But secondly, I think it's a universal aim because in the case an apocalypse does happen, every single country stands to benefit from you leaving, which is different from like protecting the environment because that is like contingent on something happening. Whereas we think there's a more universal aim, you can motivate more individual countries to work together towards this effort. So we win on two metrics. The first on scale, because you get more people saved in the event of an apocalypse that's likely to happen. But secondly, uniqueness, because we prevent all humans from dying off. There's irreversible impact that you cannot change on the other side. And we also support future people, which we think we have a duty to. Very proud to propose. Thanks.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Leader of Opposition.
Hello, sorry. Am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna organize my notes, drink a sip of water, and then I'll get started. I'll take POIs verbally, and that would be great. Cool. Cool. Okay. The opening government says that climate conservation is going to be a useless effort, but they actually haven't done enough work to show you why that just means we should give up and prepare for the worst to happen. We're going to show you inside of our case three things. Number one, why this is going to lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Number two, why the apocalypse, when it does happen, is going to manifest far worse measures on the outside of the house. And number three, why people in the most vulnerable places are screwed over and why this is the most important thing you should buy in this debate. Number one, let's talk about the self-fulfilling prophecy, and later on I'm going to beat out OG on their own metrics rhetoric of utilitarianism and all of that. What does the process of preparation actually look like? I want to note here that OG is running a slightly softer case than they actually should be by virtue of the motion. It requires OG to cut all forms of effort directed towards climate conservation, aka you abandon any kind of pollution quotas, for instance. You abandon investments in green technology that is more environmentally friendly. Why is this likely? Because the development of green technology is still far more expensive than oil-based technologies in many parts of the world that do not have comparative advantage in producing the inputs that are required to make that technology in the first place. So if you are preparing for the apocalypse as a country or as many countries around the world, the attempt to develop green technology or a more environmentally friendly technology is a liability to you. You are more likely to want to prepare in things such as, I don't know, shielding your house from the effects of the sun glaring down on it, for instance. Why is so important about this? The implication of this is that you deliberately accelerate the path to the climate apocalypse. You are going to have to accept that on the government bench, you will accept the fact that temperatures are going to rise at a far faster rates. You're going to accept that melting glaciers are going to end up flooding certain certain islands around the world. You're going to have to accept that all of those things are much more likely to happen because you have decided to abandon any measure of preventing that happening at all. You are going to have to care instead about relocating people from places like the Maldives to other parts of the world. Instead of attempting to protect the homes in which they currently live, you are willing to displace them on the side OG. The importance of this is that on their side, an apocalypse is going to be far more certain. And even if they accept this trade-off, the potential of broad mitigation or prevention is not going to be accessible to their side of the house. But why do we think that on the comparative, climate change can currently be either stopped or at worst mitigated heavily? Number one, climate change is not a binary thing. It happens in degrees and increments, which is why we think on their side it will increment even faster. Sometimes you get things like worse weather, sometimes you get things like bad harvest, but every single step you take to attempt to mitigate it now makes the effects of it in the future less likely to manifest badly, but more importantly, less likely to manifest quickly. Why is this important? Because it buys time, no thank you, for countries to prepare / mitigate these effects and thereby protect people on the ground. But B, there are always other forms of strategies to counteract that we're able to have on our side of the house. We're happy to support things like green energy, planting more trees, investing in more environmentally efficient urban planning, which is mutually exclusive because these are things that we actively prioritize and invest into when we care a lot about climate conservation. But C, and this is pretty important, on the comparative, we will at worst take mitigatory steps which are at least better than government bench. At best, we can to a large degree prevent the worst excesses of climate change that they are going to say, well, maybe it might happen, so we might as well prepare for it on their side of the house. We're going to be happy to do things like cooperate with corporations who are willing to do this, or in many cases, take legal measures to regulate the way in which they do pollution. But importantly, maintaining a global effort through treaties and climate agreements are often things that are exclusive to our side of the house. And I'm going to explain why countries are only going to operate with each other on our side. Number one, because so long as we prioritize mitigation of climate change, then we are likely to appreciate as states that the collective action is more effective. Why is this true? Number one, because economies of scale, comparative advantage, or specific advantages that certain countries have in the development of technology can be produced at scale and thereby sold out to the other countries that need it the most. But secondly, because often the worst instances of pollution are often in places like developing countries where corporations go there and pollute, where they often don't have good regulations against corporations, where they are more industrialized and therefore more likely to pollute in many cities around those countries, and therefore there is an incentive for developed countries who are less prone to this pollution to develop green technology because they have that ability and thereby subsidize and distribute it to those countries in order to stop climate change. By recognizing that it is a global effort, you're wanting to get things like treaties in which all countries cooperate with each other to be able to mitigate the worst effects. But why will countries on their side refuse to cooperate or take a POI after this? Number one, I want to use OG's principle of government duty against them, because if you buy this logic about why the government owes a duty to its people, then you ought to believe via that logic that the government's foremost priorities are to their own citizens because they are the most proximate to their government's obligations. But B, this means that things like transporting technology that is used to prepare for a climate apocalypse is a major opportunity cost to those governments at the cost of their own citizens. So to fulfill the interest and the duty that they owe to the citizens, they ought to prioritize the citizens first and not care about other countries. But see, when you're dealing with a chaotic situation in an apocalypse, you're gonna have an increased tendency to self-preservation of your own country because it is the baseline human mechanism when you're encountering many life-threatening situations. So at a large scale, states are much more likely to just go every man for themselves as opposed to cooperating with each other. Before I explain what this means, I'll take a POI.
We already fund things like climate conservatism. Despite this, the world has continuously gone to shit, and obviously we are not actually anywhere closer to solving this issue. Explain why exactly your side prevents any of this.
So we need to be comparative here, right? Maybe shit happens on our side, but shit will happen on your side worse, especially because you accept that it is already going to happen. Back to my case. What does all my analysis mean? A, when the apocalypse happens on Gulf Bench, it is going to be far worse because you accept the potentiality of things like pollution going off the rails because you're going to say, I'm just going to prepare for the possible worst case. Why do we, you ought to buy this because you're just no longer going to attempt to mitigate it on government. But number two, why is this likely to be horrific and at such a large scale to the point in which we don't think it is possible to say whether or not this is going to be sufficient? Because there are vulnerable countries out there that are less able to defend themselves against climate efforts. They simply do not have the technology or the prerequisites by which they can develop that technology at a lower cost, especially for developing countries. As a consequence, they bear the brunt of the worst excesses of climate change on their side, but often have very little ability to protect themselves and their citizens against it. In many of these cases in the future, if you accept that the worst excesses can happen, you're going to lead to things like anarchy and major strife in those countries, conflict for basic resources that are going to become exceedingly scarce because you use up these resources that are non-renewable far more. There are tons of people who are going to die anyway on their side because oftentimes the advanced technology needed to prevent climate change or mitigate the climate apocalypse is likely going to be concentrated in developed countries anyway. So you're going to, so if you're going to weigh out on OG's metric of having, like, caring about people in the future, the vast majority of people in Earth on the future will have a worse quality of life. So this clearly beats out that metric. Why is this important? Because we show you why, even if it is true that we can potentially not on our side prevent climate change completely, we still owe a duty to all these vulnerable people to attempt to do so. When the human body is drowning in water, we have a natural tendency to struggle. We think in OO, we believe in that struggle.
Thank you for that fine speech. Calling DPM.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Okay, give me a second to set up my timer. Nothing wrong with the way opposition weighs this debate. It is that the most vulnerable, which is where we disagree on the most vulnerable actor in the world. It is not the poor, it is the unborn baby that will not exist on your side of the house when the apocalypse happens. Okay, they claim that we haven't done enough to prove why climate conservation doesn't work. So here are a few layers on that. Number one, we've been at climate conservation for a long time with no foreseeable benefits. In fact, the climate has actually been going to shit way worse in recent times, even when climate conservation is at its peak. This means that in like climate mitigation of climate change has minimal benefits, if not does nothing at all. Number two, this climate conservation requires every country to be focused and working on the same thing. The climate conservation requires everybody to agree to either stop emissions or stop another thing. This is not the same on our side of the world, where outside of the world, every country pours funds into protecting their own city and their own state, as opposed to like all broadly agreeing on the same big thing. And number three, why are governments unlikely to stop emissions or like stop things, even if they agree and sign the like peace they sign climate treaties? They are very unlikely to stop MNCs from letting out emissions because a lot of the times they're profit driven and these people lobby. Okay, so let's deal with some stuff that they raise on their side. I understand that their whole rhetoric about glaciers melting and flooding out people doesn't make any sense, because when people are flooded out and when the entire country is gone, that is an apocalyptic scenario, and we will be defending against that. My friend, my team member, Fonzo, has already told you about how we'll still be building sea barriers. Because these are part of disaster mitigation, right? So when the glaciers melt and flood everybody out, this happens on either side of the house. Only that on our side of the house, we actually have we have prepared the people for this, and we have prepared maybe a spaceship to fly away. Whereas on their side of the house, they'll just go, "Oh no, we stalled this for 10 years, but now we're all going to die." They say that, okay, now moving on to some conservative rebuttals. They say that poor people will suffer on our side of the house. We say that, yeah, they're also and already suffering on your side of the house. Yes, green technology is expensive, as they claim, which is why the only people who benefit from green tech are rich people. Your pollution quotas don't operate in the regions of the poor, so this harm is parallel. they are also, poor people are also likely to be included on our side of the house anyway, because if you want humanity to survive, you're likely to sample from every region of the world to get diversity to rescue these people. Now let's compare the best case scenarios and take them charitably. In their best case scenario, you have a high likelihood of mitigating climate change, which is great, but you run a risk of everything ending in a nuclear war or in any apocalyptic scenario. In our worst case, you have a much higher likelihood of an apocalypse happening, but we will definitely survive the apocalypse. The difference here is that they accept a much higher risk of irreversible and total harm on their side that affects the most vulnerable actor in the debate. And you need to weigh this harm as way higher because that is all of humanity itself. So what's our future goal, right? We want a post-apocalyptic world that slowly rebuilds ourselves. Our comparative is that why we think the new world is going to be at least better, if not equal to the real world, is because this new world that we're going to build will lack social structures that oppress the poor. We say in your world where capitalism exists and is self-perpetuating, people continue to suffer and die whether or not you conserve the environment or not. No, they have no way to make this problem better because there currently exists no way. And our current world is already on the downturn where there are nuclear tensions and destroyed governments where the poor suffer the most. So their best case is just a world where people continue to suffer within the structures that we live in, and they have a world that is just as shit as our current world. Look, we're not saying that our new world after the apocalypse is definitely going to be better, but at least it's going to be similar. And going by at least it's going to be like, at least we get to rebuild it from the beginning. And even going by utilitarian response, this society is worthwhile and probably better than theirs. We've given you framing from the first as to why your future is more important, since there's a special duty of the government to the future population, since the future population is vulnerable and cannot fight back, and since there are just more of them. On cooperation and why we've thought that governments are inefficient and plagued by irrationality, i.e. survival through universal pushback against climate change is slow and bad. Note how apocalyptic survival bunkers are at least more independent, right? I can build my own bunkers and use my small spaceships or whatever. We get surefire benefits even if each and every country in their world doesn't cooperate with one another and instead only focuses on their own country and their own bunkers, right? They said something about how countries will all refuse to cooperate and then there will be like anarchy within the states and whatever. Understand that this is the government, and this leads into my case, which is about how preparedness is multi-purpose, unlike climate conservation. The government's what are the duties of the state? What are the government's priorities, right? It is to ensure safety for all their citizens and maintain order in the country. Now we're going to borrow Locke's social contract theory that Alfonso has already told you about just now. So why are the duties of the state not in line with climate conservation? Climate conservation is extremely long-term and is extremely contingent on other countries complying. In a scenario where it succeeds, the benefits to the individual citizen within each country should be small. All you're doing is reducing carbon emissions, etc. So why is preparedness in line with the main government's goal? Before I continue on to this, any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Okay, so why is preparedness in line with the government's goal, right? Understand that preparedness is multi-purpose. It can be used to protect against military invasions or used to protect against any scenario that could happen. Building a safety bunker is great for whether you have an earthquake or anything, even if it's not apocalyptic. Understand on our side of the world, each country's defense capabilities are increased. We think the government's funds should be used to protect their own citizens instead of being focused on the climate like on opposition side. Unlike that, we're able to protect against a variety of apocalypses. And again, Alfonso has already told you why apocalypses are very likely to happen on either side of the house, which is why each individual country should have it. And because of the fact that each individual country is extremely self-serving, we see that they are more likely to want to protect themselves and want to build their bunkers as opposed to contributing to a greater idea of climate conservation that opposition wants to push for. So why do we benefit the future people? We've already proven to you why the people of the future are the most important actor in this debate, because all governments owe a special duty to them. You irreversibly destroy the rights given to them in the future because all right is facilitated. So why do we win in this debate? We win because we benefit the entire world, whether it is our world now, in which countries will be more prepared for in which countries are more prepared for any disaster that's like to happen or any military invasion, but we also benefit the future generations and the future people, and therefore on a utilitarian metric we win, and so proud to propose.
Thank you, Colin Diallo.
Hi, can I check visible audible?
Yes to both.
All right, hi, DLO here. I'll take my POIs verbally, preferably from closing government for crossing H, but also because it's Rachel, so it's funnier. Just for a second to just organize my notes and I'll be getting water.
Okay.
All right. Let's talk about 5 things. Firstly, which is what are the threats that are actually the most likely to happen. Notably here, this is the strategic flaw that happens from opening government, because I think that they do too much. They try and tell you that there are a lot of threats that could potentially happen with the world. That there is a potential for countries to use nukes because of the increase in technology, and thus because of that, an increase in dissatisfaction in the world. There is a potential that because AIs are smarter than scientists, that they could take over the world and create apocalypse. That there is a potential for the world to fall tomorrow and there is nothing that we can do. I think that the first thing I want to point out is that there is a lack of any form of likelihood analysis as to why is it the case that any of the things that they point out are likely to happen. In fact, I'm going to point to you likelihood analysis to why is it the case that they are unlikely to happen. The thing that is necessary in order for them to point that another form of apocalypse is more important. For example, firstly, the idea about nukes with the other one, the increase in technology. I like what they say, which is that the increase of technology means that countries are more scared of each other because this means that there is a greater threat. But that's also the reason why it's the case that you're scared to, for example, send nukes to another country, because you know that if you piss off a country, even if they're smaller than you, that if they have the capacity to be able to use nukes, for example, then they will be able to decimate your entire region. That is why, for example, even America, as unhappy as it has been with North Korea, still isn't attacking North Korea because of the fact that it has the capacity to fight back. Secondly, about the idea of AI, brother in Christ, AIs have limitations and restrictions. I'm uncertain as to why it's the case that AI will ever in the inevitable future get the ability to be able to surpass that. At the end of this, what you have to buy is that there is a lack of any form of likelihood analysis for you to buy the opening government cases. And why is it the case that they're able to actually tell you why these things are less certain? Hamilton's case cuts in through this. He tells you why is it the case that the climate change damages are certain, because these are things that empirically are already happening. You look at this as the climates inevitably get worse. You look at this with the rising sea levels in tropical areas that inevitably already decimate areas. These are damages that are not only already happening, but are going to happen worse. The second thing I want to talk about is about how well you can prepare for these apocalypses, even if it is the case that they are likely to happen from the opening government case. Notably here, there are 2 things. One, for how much did they talk about? There are so many kinds of apocalypse. I'm uncertain as to why it's the case that reallocating the resources specifically for one problem is enough to solve all of the different multifaceted problems they talk about. Understand, resources spread thin. The more you divert the focus of a resource towards from one area to multiple different areas, the less money that each area gets. So for example, my billions of dollars that goes towards climate change only become mere tens of millions of dollars if I'm trying to consolidate for every single kind of apocalypse that can happen. Things like, for example, military, things like, for example, AI, things like, for example, whatever they say about earthquakes. These are things that require differing things. They say the bunkers for wars and earthquakes are the same. Correct, but what bunkers will you need for AIs? You still need distinct things that mitigate distinct areas, especially if you're trying to prepare for the worst case scenarios like what opening government has. The problem of opening government is just the lack of any form of focus, which leads towards them getting crippled by this mechanism. But the second thing is that if these threats are already high for these individual nations, such for example Japan with its earthquakes, or South Korea with its threats of the war against North Korea because Kim Jong-un wants to cross the North Peninsula, then these are already areas, because of these high levels of threat and because the citizens on the ground feel the pressures from these high levels of threat, they already lobby their governments for changes and lobby their governments for increased preparedness. So I'm uncertain as to why is it the case that, considering the fact that in high-risk nations that these investments already happen, that this incremental increase in the amount of changes and the incremental budget increase is going to be the likely tipping point of this debate. I am uncertain as to why is it the case that any of the opening government mechanisms already accrue. All you have to buy at the end of this is that opening government just doesn't have a real case because they just made a clear strategic error. The third thing I want to talk about then is the main attacks that they have against the climate change portion. Notably here, they have 2 main attacks. Firstly, that we have already crossed the threshold of climate change of the degree pattern, and thus because of that, it is pointless for us to continue fighting back. Notably here, in order for you to buy this claim, you have to buy that climate change and the effects of it is binary. Either climate change effects don't happen or climate change effects does happen. But that's kind of not how climate change works, right? Climate change effects happen in increments, aka for every degree that the climate gets worse, there are worse effects to be had. So for example, if there is a 1 degree increase, then maybe you get worse weather conditions. If there is a 2 degree increase, then you're unable to grow crops because it is too hot. If there's a 3 degree increase, then your lands get filled by water because of the rising sea levels. At the end of this, what you have to buy is, yes, maybe climate does get worse on both sides of the house, but it's about extent. Insofar as the mitigation strategies that Hamilton tells you about countries working together for them to be able to do things like develop EVs, and for them to be able to do things like, for example, work together to be able to give resources, such as, for example, spread their green technologies and reduce the carbon emissions, then these effects get much less. So these effects are things that we can actively change, but more importantly, are things that are reasonable threats that can actually help individuals on the ground. This is a more grounded mechanism in comparison to opening government, and this is a much more likely impact in comparison to them. You also have to buy this on likelihood. The fourth thing then is about why people will work together. Notably here, opening government just says countries don't listen, but they don't ever tell you what is the incentive for these countries not to listen, other than the broad reasons of, oh, they are irrational and they are capitalistic. Hence, these are buzzwords, they're not mechanisms. I'll give you 3 actual mechanisms as to why is it the case that governments will actually likely do these things well. Firstly, is that the local citizens on the ground actually feel the effects of climate change. Things like, for example, the groceries in your shops getting more expensive because of the fact that crops are getting destroyed. Things like, for example, the fact that tropical nations are already feeling the effects of rising sea levels means that oftentimes people already feel these effects. Secondly, they see these effects in media, things like social media, telling you about why is it the case that a farmer cannot survive because of the fact that climate change destroyed his crop yield. This creates an empathetical gap that local voters on the ground then use to pressure and lobby governments to be able to enact changes and help other developing nations. You see this empirically with things like, for example, the Gazan war, where even though people on the ground never actually knew about Gaza beforehand, never actually interacted with a singular Gazan individual, that they still decided to help out and rise up to fund these things, even though that they had no real incentive to, because there is some form of empathy there. When you see another human being suffer, this is the same empathy that is going to be used to lobby their governments to do these things well. But thirdly, I'm going to flip the capitalistic mindset on them, which that these things oftentimes accrue economical benefits. That if the world's goals is to mitigate climate environments, then industries like EVs, industries like, for example, green technologies start to thrive more because these are the things that countries need to buy in order to mitigate these strategies. So oftentimes these are the industries that these developed nations start to invest into massively because of the economical benefits it can bring. That's why, for example, America right now is investing massively in Tesla, because the fact that it's so economically viable for them to be able to take over the green market that they're willing to do these things. Overall, what this means is that A, poor countries are likely to get the help that they need, but B, most importantly, technology is likely to work out and everyone's likely to work together. Overall, on likelihood, we just have to win. For all those reasons, you have to go with OO.
Thank you. Now calling member of CUF.
Hi, just give me a second.
Also, by the way, I'm not sure if it's only just me, but I can only send messages to Cap, so I can't POI in chat. I don't know why.
Let me see if I can change a setting or something. Let me see.
Judges ready?
Yes.
Okay. Kibun, can I start or are you still resolving the chat issue?
Give me like 30 seconds.
Yeah, okay.
settings. What I would suggest for people who like POIs in chat is to do like a react. Like do a react, I guess.
Like raise hand. Like let's just do raise hand.
Raise hand or anything else, yeah. Yeah, if that works for everyone.
I'll take POI's verbal. Government says that an apocalypse is inevitable, and an apocalypse is inevitable because two things. Firstly, the development of technology, and second, that people will preemptively attack other countries because they are fearful of like being attacked first. There's like two problems to this, right? Firstly, that the thing about AI is that it is developed by scientists, and scientists ultimately have a lot of control over them. So sure, be it as it may that AI is technically smarter than scientists insofar as they know more because they know a lot about the internet. Ultimately, like the extent of their power will always be like below the power of the scientists at the point in which scientists can control what they can and cannot do. So the implication therefore is I'm uncertain as to like how AI and the threat of it can like really convert into becoming an apocalyptic threat. The second thing then is about like okay, nuclear wars, for example. The first rebuttal is from OO that like you don't want to attack other people because you're scared that they will attack you back and you're scared of like you're scared of like them using nuclear threats on you too. The thing about all leaders, whether they are irrational or not, is that they have an incentive to care about people on the ground. It's that they have an incentive to care about people on the ground, or at the very least, they have an incentive to care about themselves. This is then to suggest that taking the O's analysis and adding on that like because you don't want yourself to be nuked, you don't want your family members to be nuked. If you're a good leader, you don't want your country to be nuked, for example. This is also suggests then that you're unlikely going to do preemptive attacks at the point in which you're scared of the other country attacking back. But also the thing to note is that like maybe in politics now we see like people like leaders throwing out like I have nukes and I'm going to nuke you and all these threats coming out. But the thing to note is that people often like it is very easy to say something, but it's much more difficult to actually stick to it. Look at the Cold War, for example, where like USSR and USA kept threatening to nuke each other and kept threatening to develop their nuclear arsenal, but things never actually materialized, and they actually like got to some form of agreement and like pull away their nukes, for example. The implication here is simple: that apocalypse just simply isn't as likely as the government claims. But okay, let's be charitable. Let's say that an apocalypse is inevitable. So the question then in this debate on the government metric is when do we ought to start taking these measures? The problem with government is they talk about why why apocalypse preparedness is the most important thing in this debate, but they don't ever tell you what this like apocalyptic preparedness actually looks like. The most we get is like bunkers, for example. But the thing to note is twofold. Firstly, at the point in which you believe government that we haven't done enough or we haven't started on apocalyptic preparedness, it means that it requires a lot of inertia to get this train rolling, and it requires a lot of like significant funding and effort to actually develop some form of progress within this. So to get to the extent of having like a rocket ship, for example, that OG wants to talk to you about, to fly to another planet, I think this is going to take a lot of time, but two, it's also going to take a lot of resources. Another thing to note about displacement in general. If you're displacing people from like one country to another, this is already bad and deeply unpopular at the point in which people have homes that they attach sentimental value to. They have communities that they want to stay in, and the communities are beyond people, but communities are your surroundings as well. People are just resistant to being uplifted so willy-nilly. But the second thing is like, okay, if an apocalypse happens and Earth goes to shit, it's uncertain whether like we can actually go to another like planet yet. At a point in which scientists haven't even discovered this at all. This is all to suggest then that sure, maybe apocalypse is inevitable, but it's likely going to be a process that takes a lot of time. Why is time something that we do not have in this debate? I think the narrative you send when you pass this policy that we would like cut all of our efforts that have gone to climate conservation has gone to shit. I think the message you're sending people on the ground is that the Earth is fucked, that all of our efforts have wasted and never materialized, and instead we're going to look towards relocating to another planet. This is likely going to cause panic insofar as people now perceive the world to be fucked. This has two impacts on this impacts two people. Firstly, on corporations. The only reason why corporations are sustainable right now, the only reason why they don't pollute that much in LDCs and why they like maintain to ESG laws, for example, is precisely because the government set laws and regulations sets these laws and regulations to prevent them from doing so. At the point in which the government cuts all these laws and cuts any investment funding, etc., into these areas, I think corporations uniquely then don't have an incentive to stick to ESG laws anymore. Don't stick to ESG laws anymore. So what then is going to happen on the government? At the point in which corporations no longer care about like sticking to ESG laws and finding like the most environmentally sustainable or environmentally friendly tech because of their profit making incentive, and they want to reduce like the operational cost in their business, they're likely going to go towards cheaper products. The thing about cheaper products is that in its nature, because it is cheaper, it likely means that it doesn't have such advanced and such novel technology that like fights for climate conservation. So for example, maybe they don't have like the most up to date internal combustion engine, and consequently there's a high carbon footprint. The implication here, and this doesn't affect one corporation, this affects all, because right now in the status quo, corporations fight each other to become the most ESG and the most environmentally friendly corporation. But the comparative is when there's no need to care anymore, corporations will instead fight for the cheapest like operational cost, meaning it's going to be a race to the bottom where there's more and more carbon emissions being produced. But the second thing is also on people. If government is right to say that people are apathetic now, I think people become even more apathetic, or even more like just don't care about the environment in their world. Insofar as the world is fucked, there's no reason why I shouldn't litter, and there's no reason why I shouldn't do things that are convenient to me. I.e., in Singapore, I'm just going to turn my aircon to 16 degrees and I'm going to leave my aircon on all the time because that's the most convenient, and that's because Singapore is incredibly hot. This also suggests then that an apocalypse is going to become a lot more accelerated on their side of the house. On their side of the house. Note that this weighs over 00 because the only 00 metric on like acceleration of an apocalypse is saying glaciers melt and temperatures go up. We give you reasons why corporations and people are likely going to put effort into accelerating the apocalypse, into happening. Why is this then important, and why does this lose government in the debate? At the point in which the apocalypse happens sooner, you have a shorter runway to actually like invest efforts into into the development of apocalypse preparedness. What is the implication then? Because you're relocating people and displacing people, you're relocating and uplifting whole societies. This is something that requires a lot of effort, and this is something that you ought to be careful with. At the point in which you don't have time, I think you are unlikely going to do a job well at all. And lastly, the last thing I'm going to talk about then is like this clash on like mitigation or prevention. The reason the thing about mitigation is that it also like aligns itself with like the government idea on prevention, because in the process of mitigation, in the process of like fighting like climate change and doing climate conservative actions, maybe you don't actually fight back against the climate, maybe you don't cause a lot of change. That's like the bullet like I'm going to bite, and I'm going to take the government at the best case. Maybe temperatures will still go up, and at the very least, through our mitigation efforts, we are buying more time so that more efforts and more research can be done into doing proper like R&D for like these technologies that government want to talk about. The comparative is simple. On government, these things are a lot more rushed, and these things are likely to be of lower quality. This is horrible at the point in which it affects many people, and with lower quality goods, I think just people are just at like higher risk of like harms. For all these reasons, CEO.
Thank you for that. Now calling Gopvir.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, awesome. She, her pronouns, I guess POIs, you can react. Give me a second. Okay, let me get my timer. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The entire government bench has failed to do two things. Firstly, they haven't actually told us why the world of the apocalypse is going to be even like better than the world that probably exists after a lot of climate conservation has happened, let alone why that world would possibly be better than the world that we're trying to like ensure happens, right? And secondly, they haven't actually fulfilled the burden of proving why it is necessary to stop every single piece of funding that goes towards climate conservation in the effort of producing some sort of world that is just probably going to be very bad, right? First, I think it's important to just very quickly deal with OG. The entire case is about, if you actually listen to most of their case that No House actually tries to take down, right? It's the only thing that exists. They try to basically create something like a new world. They don't actually tell us where this new world is happening, if it's happening on a spaceship, if it's happening on the desolate wasteland that is probably going to happen, whether it's happening inside the bunkers, who is going to govern this apocalyptic future, right? The only people that come close to trying to describe this is closing government, and they do this in a very bad way towards their case, right? Firstly, they try to run this idea of how we're going to change the perception. We think that the perception of the apocalypse is going to be very good because people are so apathetic. They only care as long as they see a bunch of bunkers around them, and even as a poor person, you're somehow going to get access to these bunkers and things like that. And I think firstly, closing government tries so hard to make it sound like the public is going to be inspired to discuss. What does the word discuss even mean? So what if the public cares? What is the public able to do? If it is true that there's no point in trying to save the climate and the government is going to be taking control of anything anyway, the only thing these people have to do is cooperate. And I think that Mark has given you a few reasons as to why these people simply will not cooperate, right? Sure, the reason that the idea of the apocalypse seems so far away from you is because, sure, you don't live with the apocalypse, you don't see it every day. The only concept you have of climate change is that sometimes the day gets hotter, sometimes you read an article about how the ice that, right? Why then is the apocalypse something that is frightening? They don't actually tell you what the government does to ensure how this news is spread. I'm just going to assume that the government is just going to start undertaking measures and everybody finds out about it, right? Slowly, the concept comes to you that the house that you've lived in for years, the people that you've known for years, they could die, the flash floods could come and destroy the place that you are living in, and the only thing that your government is doing is just taking you out of there and putting you somewhere else, or building a place underground where you might never actually see the light of day again, where you might never actually be able to go to school again or talk to your friends. Your life will be changed forever. Suddenly, when this dawns upon you, I don't think you're going to have a rational response of, oh, I'm going to sit down with my friends and I'm going to discuss climate change, what we can possibly do, how we can make our lives better. I think you're probably going to be really afraid, right? You're going to be afraid and you're going to be scared. I think the many instances in which war has happened throughout history that have become exceedingly close to apocalypses, right? Clearly, the people involved in those scenarios have not had rational responses. They are scared, they are terrified, they don't listen to what the government is trying to tell them because all they want to do is just have their lives go back to the way they were. They live in a state of denial. None of the houses in this debate necessarily prove to me why the rational response is likely to kick in when the life that you've always known is suddenly upended, right? So I think this entire concept of perception of the apocalypse, the word apocalypse itself is terrifying to most people. They just don't do enough to work as to prove why people are just suddenly going to be okay with the fact that the apocalypse, the erosion of their entire life is going to happen to them. Next, I think it's important to take clashes in this debate and therefore explain why we're able to take over OO, right? Note then that OO didn't actually tell you why the world in which this they don't actually tell you why the world in which this apocalypse happened is actually going to be worse, right? I think Mark firstly tells you why it is that the apocalypse is going to be accelerated and why the efforts to just stop climate change entirely are just going to make things worse, right? Firstly, the fact that companies do not need to adhere to these ESG laws, so they're just going to do whatever they want as long as it profits them in the end. Secondly, there's the obvious idea of people who are panicked. They feel like they're trapped on this like rock that is probably going to explode in their minds. What's the point of living? What's the point of going on if the world as I know it is never going to be the same again? No matter how well the government decides to portray this to them, this is probably going to look like the worst possible case scenario for them, right? Thus, there's just a lot less effort that's going to be put by the people and by the most powerful entities, which closing government literally says most of the governments in this debate are being like lobbied for by like corporations and things like that, right? So what then this apocalyptic world look like? I think first of all, right, you cannot possibly claim that poor people are going to be like, I don't know, protected in the case of the apocalypse or things like that, right? If it is true, the governments are lobbied by corporations, and understandably, because of the panic that is generated during the times of the apocalypse, these governments are probably going to lose a lot of foothold of power and the ability to convince people that everything is okay. I think that therefore, corporations and people with a lot of money are probably going to have the first grabs when things happen in the apocalypse, right? I think that access to bunkers, access to very important resources and things like that is inevitably going to first go to like rich people and things like that, right? I think that poor people are just going to have a lot less access in the world to begin with, not even withstanding the fact that poorer countries in this debate generally have less like economic power and like say towards what happens to the environment. In general, they're just not going to have much say when the apocalypse eventually happens and things like that on their side of the house, right? Why then are we able to win on this debate? Firstly, because we are actually able to tell you why the apocalypse gets worse and is accelerated on their side of the house. Secondly, I think that if the effect of apocalyptic evacuation is just something that's going to create a lot of unrest and unhappiness and just less regulation with the government at hand, right? Why then is just our world so much better? Simply put, I think it is important to understand that there is genuine proof that exists that the climate change can be stopped, right? Or at the very least mitigated to like a small extent. Things like ensuring that greenhouse gases don't get out of control, things like making sure imposing stricter laws on animal farms and things like that. These sort of measures are able to ensure that the extent of climate change is able to be mitigated at the largest extent. Because you are not able to prove why it is necessary to take all the funding, all the reasons away from these things, right? Why then you are still able to create a better apocalyptic world in the future, right? And the second thing then is that you like okay, wait, actually forget that. Why then are we able to take over opposition? Firstly, sure, they're able to tell you that, oh, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy that happens because of green technology and things like that. But they don't actually tell you what the apocalypse is likely to get worse. They say things like political tensions and things like that. But even without these political tensions, right, the word of the apocalypse itself is going to get worse because of rich corporations being able to get a larger foothold on how this apocalyptic world is ran and things like that, right? I think that because you're causing such a large upending, right, and you don't actually tell me what the preparation to create this world, create this apocalyptic world that is so good looks like, right? The entire government bench is losing this debate. Thus, I think as side closing opposition, firstly, I think we're able to fulfill the burden to tell you that in any possible scenario, even if the government that runs this apocalyptic world is going to be so good, I think that the people within this world are just probably going to suffer, not want to listen to these regulations. Eventually, it's going to get out of hand, right? Because they just can't get the life that they wanted back. Lastly, I think that therefore we've shown you why it just starts better to prepare for the future and at least create a world that both the future, the people from the future and the poor people living now are still able to live in without much displacement and like horrible things happening to them in their lives, right? Thus, I think it is better to fight rather than to just kill over and
Time.
die. So, see you.
Thank you for that. With that, we come to the end of this debate. Thank you so much for a wonderful debate. Could the judges join me in room 2D?